Dear student, आज की क्लास में we will try to discuss about classical political philosophy, and under it first we have to understand what is text and interpretation. So let's go to the topic. So what is text? Text can be any printed part of a book, magazine. It can be of novel. It can be in the form of any books. It can be in the form of any classical work. So the under the definition of text, we all include these different kinds of things that it can be in written form. Now, let's come to how do we read these texts. That's an important question that is faced by different generations of scholar. How do we read these texts? So there are two important ways, that is textual approach and contextual approach. दो अलग अलग तरीके हैं टेक्स्ट को समझने का, जिसे हम टेक्सुअल अप्रोच कहते हैं और कॉन्टेक्सुअल अप्रोच कहते हैं. अब हम देखते हैं टेक्सुअल अप्रोच का मतलब क्या होता है. तो टेक्सुअल अप्रोच का जो मेजर फोकस है वो, जैसा हम देख रहे हैं कि वो टेक्स्ट के ऊपर होता है, उसके जो लिखी गई बातें हैं, वर्ड्स हैं, उनके ऊपर होता है. और इसके अंतर्गत, इस अप्रोच के अंतर्गत, वी डोंट गो इनटू द कॉन्टेक्सुअल पार्ट. दैट इज, वी डू नॉट look into the context in which the particular writing was written. For an example, अगर हिंदू स्वराज important book written by गांधी जी, तो हम लोग we don't see when it was written. Just we read the text and try to make sense of it. So one of the important idea behind the textual approach is that we don't go into the context. We also don't see the intention of the author. What was the intention of the author behind writing that particular book. Next, once a book is published, that is in public domain, the author is said to be dead. Means the author does not have to tell what was the intention. So it's a reader, it's an interpreter who makes sense of it. So it can be varieties of interpretation can be made by different generations of philosopher or interpreter with regard to this textual approach. So the basics is that you should read on text, don't go into context. Context can be historical, political, and number of historical contexts, philosophical and others. Now let's come to the important proponent. Who was the important proponent? So Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss is an American philosopher and is said to be the chief exponent of this particular approach. He was basically a German refugee who actually left the Nazi Germany and went finally to USA to escape himself from persecution of the Nazi Germany. Important thing that you should know about him is that he had a very bad memory of the Weimar Republic when Hitler got into power, and how the whole Nazi regime has created a kind of a situation in which Jews were persecuted. So he was primarily critical of the modern liberal society, modern liberalism, and also the liberal democratic regime. Primarily, he thought that these modern liberalism and liberal democratic regime was unable to challenge and allowed the Hitler to gain power in Germany. So primarily he is criticized that, and he primarily goes into the very idea which was given by the classic writers, including Plato and Aristotle. He says that these modern liberal ideas, starting from Hobbes to present, is without normative foundation. So these writers from Hobbes to present is without normative foundation, and that's why what happened, that the lack of normative foundation allowed Hitler to gain power in Germany. And that's why he's critical to the liberal democratic regime and modern liberal idea. So his focus is primarily that we should read the text of the classical writers who have given a number of normative aspects. The need is to revive that. Now, these are some of the things that have been said by Leo Strauss. he says that the teachings of the great political philosopher are important not only historically, the questions raised by the political philosopher of the past are alive in our society. So he primarily emphasizes on the embedded idea which were there in the classical writers. Especially, he talks about Plato and Aristotle. He also says that there is the writings which are written by these writers are in invisible ink. Point is that the important philosopher or interpreter has to interpret those writings. They also contain these writings which were written by these classical writers also are repository of profound truth about the political life goals and also illuminate the political situation in which they were produced. So the need, he emphasizes that there is need to properly study those classical writers, and we should do away with the many confusion that are faced by the contemporary politics. So these are the things which are said by Leo Strauss. So out of it, what we gain, that textual approach primarily says that there are vital, important moral and important educative value that are embedded in the classical text, and the need is to read those texts time and again, and that therefore we can explore the real truth. So he goes into reading the text. Now, these are some of the examples of textual approach. Like if we take up Aristotle, his famous word that man is a political animal. So, what does political animal means? For Aristotle, he says that the man was different from other living beings, and those person who is living outside the state, because it is the state where individual enjoys the good life. So those who remain outside the state would not enjoy the good life, and he may be a wild savage who is living outside the rubric of the state. So under the umbrella of state, individual enjoys all the good life. So the person who lives out does not enjoy this, and maybe a sage, or maybe a god, or maybe a savage. So it is so this is a basic textual interpretation of the word man is a political animal. Then again we come to another important quotation by Aristotle when he says the state is prior to man. So when we literally try to make sense of it, state is prior to man, we are astonished. How does a state comes before man? But here the idea of Aristotle is a different way. Here the use of logic has been done, that we will read also later. So primarily he says that the basic idea is that state is prior to man because the man realizes his own potentiality within the state. So state should come first. Also he says that we cannot realize the importance of part in the sense, if we are a body, we cannot identify a particular part of the body and attach importance to that part without imagining the whole body. So the whole body is important. That's why he emphasizes that state is important, and state, that's why it was prior to man. So individual outside the state loses his identity. So primarily says that the part which is detached from the whole body does not have any significance. Same is with the individual. Individual cannot realize himself unless until he is part of the state. So state thus comes prior to man. Historically it may not be true, but logically it makes sense. Now another interpretation or example that we can take from textual approach is of Rousseau's idea of general will, when he says man can be forced to be free. So there are different interpretation of it, but when we go to textual approach, what does it primarily says? Why individual should be forced to be free? Here we have to understand his idea of general will. When he says about general will, he specifically he comes to his idea and breaks this idea that there is something called general will. We have to understand initially what is he talks about. He says that there is something called human will, means individual will, and it is has two components. One is individual, which has a particular will, and this can be divided into two parts. An individual may have two kinds of will: actual will and real will. So actual will is primarily motivated by our self-interest, and that's why it is represents lower self and differs from individual to individual. So actual will primarily means selfish will or selfish interest. Real will is primarily about the ultimate selfless kind of will, which is of higher self, and this is important for community. When you leave your self-interest, then you can talk about the larger community, because you shun your self-interest. So here he makes the difference between actual will and real will. How is it connected to the idea that man can be forced to be free? Now, talking about his idea of general will, he says that all real will, where individual shuns his self-interest, that is combined, means all the real will are combined, that would lead to general will. So he says that to ensure this general will, to ensure a kind of a will in society where each and everyone is represented, where everyone is heard, an individual can be forced also, so that the real will actually prevails in society. So primarily he says that to allow society to run smoothly, it is important to follow real will of each and every individual, and those who are still guarded by or propelled by actual will, they can be forced to follow this general will. So this is the basic idea, and this is basic interpretation through textual approach. Now there are criticism that is leveled against this textual approach. First, you can say one of the important criticism that is leveled against textual approach, that it lacks the contextual part, that we'll see the contextual approach separately. But primarily the context, we don't read about the context in which a particular writing is written. Under the textual approach, we primarily focus upon the text. We don't see the intention of the author under textual approach. So these are limitation of textual approach. Specifically coming to the Straussian school, or criticism of Straussian school of thought, which is a part of, we can say, a textual approach. So he says the criticism which is leveled against the Strauss argument, he says that the criticism which is leveled against the textual approach is that because Strauss primarily says that we should look into the books of classical writers. So how do we go about it? Do we need to have some different kind of knowledge to interpret these books? So this is a criticism that is leveled against the Strauss or the textual approach, that the textual approach primarily rely on some kind of insider's knowledge that is available only to those